Welcome, everyone. Please be advised that today's webcast is being recorded. I wanted to welcome you all to the RAPS webcast, Effective Medical Device Pre-Sub Interactions, and this is sponsored by Med Institute. My name is Joanne Wan, and I'll be your host for today's webcast. Please submit any questions that you have for Dan into the chat pod, and that's found in the bottom left of your screen. We will have time after the presentation to answer your questions. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dan Dillon. Dan Dillon has more than 30 years of experience in medical device testing, data analysis, and global regulatory submission preparation. He has worked with a variety of companies including Stryker, Boston Scientific, and Olympus. Dan has worked on more than 95 10Ks, as well as PMAs, IDE submissions. With this experience has come a broad exposure to a wide variety of medical devices, vascular and non-vascular stents, capital equipment, endoscopes, catheters, emergency medical devices, and ophthalmological products, to name a few. And Dan has provided regulatory strategy, team leadership, and FDA meeting coordination for numerous projects. He is Regulatory Affairs Certified, a member of Cook Group's FDA Policy Working Group, and provides instruction on FDA submissions at Purdue University. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Dan to begin his presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Joanne. Again, this is Dan Dillon. We have an hour and a half. I think the presentation portion of this will take about an hour, and then there'll be time for questions, maybe some case studies. Joanne's talked a little bit about me. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the company I've been working for the past 10 years. Med Institute is a Cook company. We've supported Cook Medical for 30 years as a sort of in-house contract research organization. From time to time, we've supported other companies in the development of their devices. About a year ago, a little over a year ago, we decided to focus 100% on helping other companies. So we've been offering our expertise in testing, engineering, submissions, and clinical study management. To be honest, it's been kind of exciting to meet new people, new products, but still be able to bring to them 30 years of experience with the world's largest privately held medical device company. We're still owned by the Cook family. Next slide has a little bit of background on me. 30 years in the industry, 26 in regulatory affairs. So like a lot of us, we didn't start in regulatory affairs, and the rest of this slide has pretty much everything else that you've already heard from Joanne. So the topic for today is effective medical device pre-sub interactions. We'll divide this into 4 parts. I'm going to offer some introductory thoughts just to sort of frame the guidance document. There is a guidance document out there, so we'll spend some time going through what the guidance document talks about. But to really make this worthwhile, we'll then go back and I'll offer some strategy and tactics for effective interactions, so that things that aren't necessarily written in the guidance document that Med Institute has just accumulated over the years of experience. And to be honest, so strategy and tactics is sort of the second level goal, but maybe the third level goal, the big goal, is to give everybody a sense of I can do this, I can go through with this, I can go through this in a comfortable manner, in a professional manner, and when I get the bad feedback that sometimes occurs, whether that's in a meeting or in a letter, that I know how to handle that and I know to address that. So really we want to try to give people a little extra confidence by sharing some of our thoughts. So that third part, strategy and tactics, we're essentially going to go through the same slides with a little more detail. So introductory thoughts. I'm having trouble advancing my slides. There we go. What's the pre-sub program? It is a guidance-based program, so it's not in the law, before or outside formal binding pre-market processes whereby you submit a written request for FDA to provide written feedback on specific questions. So a classic example is a pre-IDE to get feedback on animal testing. So it's outside the formal processes, so it can't really be appealed, but that's sort of the point. The point is to have a conversation. The program, the guidance, officially dates from 2014. That's when it was finalized. A draft was issued in 2012, but the draft actually replaces a pre-IDE guidance dating from 1999. Over the years, FDA just sort of added things in the same bucket as pre-IDEs. So there's really been a long history of informal interactions, meetings, et cetera. So the guidance really just codifies the process. And the link down there is intended to give you the the direct link to it, but you can just search in FDA's page and find it pretty easily as well. Well, there's another way of looking at this. What is a pre-sub? It's really an excellent opportunity to make a good first impression with FDA on a product, to sort out major issues in a non-adversarial manner because it is informal, and then to educate FDA perhaps on novel or complicated or controversial topics. So that's sort of the soft way of looking at it. Well, then you have this question, should I even be submitting a pre-sub? Forget about all the details of the guidance document. Should I even be submitting it because it's not binding? And what I've sort of found as I've interacted with people, you get two not so good answers. One's a sort of always yes, 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 and then the other one is never. The never is much more common. The always is sort of, well, it can't hurt to call up FDA. Well, it can if you don't know what you're doing. You could end up having FDA drive your project rather than you driving it. And never is not a really good answer. Sometimes you'll have people say, well, never ask a question you don't have the answer to. You should feel confident in your answer, and you shouldn't be asking FDA because all they'll do is give you the answer you don't want. But what if the question or the answer is complicated? And waiting until you're all done with the project, getting all your data done, could be very costly. If you do the wrong test, no amount of results will change FDA's opinion. So really the better answer is it depends. So what are some of the factors that you need to consider? Well, one thing would be, is the device new to you? Have you never done this before? Or is it new to the FDA? They've never done this before. How new is it? One of the ways you can figure out how new something is how well do guidance documents or consensus standards or other PMA summaries or 510K summaries apply. If you can look at that, then maybe you've got all the information you need and you just go forward. Sometimes the question is, where are you in the development cycle? How expensive is it to be wrong? To be honest, sometimes you think I'd like to have a discussion with the FDA, but you're pretty much done with the project. So even if you got major questions, you just say, let's just go ahead and send in the submission. So you want to have a pre-sub. What kind of questions? Now, some of these come from the guidance, some of them don't. But here's some of the typical questions that are worth discussing. Do you agree with our test matrix? Here's our risk matrix, FDA. Do you think we've captured everything in terms of risks? Do you agree with our regulatory pathway? Can you review this animal testing protocol or this animal design because we've got a question about test model? Can you review this clinical study outline, pay special attention to primary endpoints and hypotheses? These are the types of questions that are worth discussing. It really is, again, somewhat subjective. But having sort of laid that groundwork for what it is and when you might want to use it, how you might want to use it, let's just actually go through the guidance document and talk about some of the key things. It's a 57-page guidance document, very detailed, a lot of repetition. I'm only going to hit on the high points, but you really should try to read the guidance. Hopefully this will have helped you. It's long, but it's really not a difficult guidance to read. So if we use this classic example of a pre-IDE, this is what the guidance document talks about. It says we need a cover letter, table of contents, description, indications, previous discussions or submissions that may have occurred, an overview of product development, the background for the question you're asking, your specific questions, your proposed attendees from the company and from FDA, and then a method for feedback. You can get your feedback in writing only. You can have a face-to-face meeting. You can do it via phone. I'll just point out that the stuff I've circled here from cover letter, all in the first column, and then the questions, et cetera, those are standard parts of all kinds of pre-subs. As a matter of fact, pretty much every submission where it's the first time you're going to introduce something to the FDA, you ought to have a cover letter, a table of contents, a device description, and an indications for use. That just sort of goes without saying. Some of these other things are specific to pre-subs, which of course means that this area is really unique to each type of pre-sub, and it's unique in a couple of different ways. It's unique because different pre-subs, they have different things they'd like to see. It's also unique because just by the nature of your device, the background information you're going to provide is going to be very different. The questions you're trying to ask are going to be different, and you need to support them properly. So this is sort of an overview of what's going to be required. Now, the other thing to know is the FDA has a Q-sub acceptance checklist. It's not as onerous as, say, the 510K refuse to accept checklist, but it does serve you well to take a look at the guidance document, go to the back, and make sure you've included the minimum required information that FDA wants. So you send in your pre-sub, And here's what happens next. FDA schedules a meeting with you within 21 days. That's when they schedule it, not when it actually happens. But they commit in the guidance to finalizing the meeting within 21 days. Then there's this long pause. 3 days before the meeting, FDA commits to providing written comments to you. So typically they've met perhaps 13 days before the meeting or 10 days before the meeting. They give you the comments. They ask you to provide slides 2 days before the meeting. Again, the meeting is supposed to occur, target 75 days, but they give themselves up to 90, and to be honest, most of the time it's been 90. And then the sponsor provides draft minutes to FDA within 15 minutes of the meetings, 15 days after the meeting. That's a calendar day, so they've committed to that. And then FDA takes up to 30 days to review the minutes, and then they become final within 15 days unless you object, in which case you have another conversation about the meeting, typically via phone. And again, we'll go into some more detail about this, but I just want to note that if you sort of take the minimum amount of interactions, you're talking about in the course of a pre-sub meeting, at least 7 interactions with the FDA. To be honest, it's usually much more. Some of them are very small, just trying to schedule the meeting. Other times they can be quite substantive. Feedback from the meeting. FDA has committed to standing by their feedback. Mind you, it is a guidance, it's a program, it's not required by law, but in their guidance they said they want to stand by their feedback. They have said that this is all part of their MDUFMA negotiations, that they committed to trying to be better at this sort of thing. So they have 3 conditions where they say that, well, we might change our feedback. One would be information in the formal submission is consistent with the pre-sub information. So that means if you change the design, they can change their mind. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The data in future submissions do not raise important issues. Well, this is sort of common sense. You agree on this is the type of test you're supposed to do. You do the test. You get unexpected results, or at least what they consider to be unexpected results, and they reserve the right to say, look, we need you to do some more testing. And then material issues have arisen since the time of their feedback, new scientific findings about risk. So, for instance, literature comes out, published studies comes out, they're doing some adverse event monitoring, and they suddenly have new questions, and they reserve the right to say, look, based on those new questions, that new literature, we need to ask you some additional questions. And they say this about clinical studies in particular. We recommend that if more than 1 year has passed since our last feedback on key clinical trial design elements, with no new submission to the agency, by that they would mean an IDE submission, sponsors should contact the review branch to confirm that the previous advice, really their advice, is still valid. Just note, I added the italics to emphasize this statement. So there are other pre-submissions. I mentioned, we talked about pre-IDEs, but there's also pre-510Ks, pre-PMAs, pre-HDEs. The guidance is entitled pre-sub, so sometimes people will alternate between calling something a pre-sub or a Q-sub or a pre-IDE, just informally as we're talking about it. It's because the guidance talks about some other informal meetings that aren't strictly pre-sub meetings, but they're all considered Q-sub because they're all given a designation of Q, XXXX, 2 digits for the year, 4 digits for the accession number. So just like we have K numbers for 510Ks and IDE numbers have G numbers, they have Q numbers. So what are those other submissions? This table is straight from their guidance. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different meetings in addition. Most of them are face-to-face. One is not. Most of them have a variety of time frames to respond to. The informational meeting, the study risk determination, the submission issue meeting, we'll talk a little bit about those in the next few slides. We're not really going to talk about agreement meetings or determination meetings. Those are established by law. They're written into the law. There's a guidance to support both of them. They're rarely used because they are very formal processes. There's very specific commitments that FDA requires, and FDA has to stick to them. So they really try to avoid that because you just never know what might happen. So you can kind of sympathize with them in that way. So they try to avoid them, or else they make very few commitments. The Day 100 meeting is a sort of submission issue meeting. It also is established by law, and there's a guidance to support it. It's routinely used for PMAs. At the 100th day, you can arrange to have a meeting with FDA. I'm not going to try to cover it today because the principles still apply, but there's a whole separate guidance document on it. And if you're going to submit a PMA, that is something you should be familiar with. So about these other meetings, an informational meeting is for sharing information with FDA without feedback. It's good for a new device where you've got significant differences in technology from currently available device. So if you've done something in a way that nobody's ever done it before and you simply want to put it in front of FDA so they can see it, this would be an informational meeting. So this would be very, very early in development. It's also for review of ongoing device development when there's multiple submissions. So I know of at least one manufacturer, at least for a while, was having essentially monthly meetings with FDA because they had about 3 or 4 submissions going on at any one time, and just said, look, if we can have 15 minutes of your time once a month, that'll just make life easy for everybody. And FDA appreciated that. So they accept these requests as resources allow. They may not think your device is all that new and so turn you down, or they may just say, look, we've got other priorities. And that the guidance says that FDA may ask clarifying questions. So a study risk determination meeting, this is where you have what you believe to be a non-significant risk device, and you want to get FDA's opinion on it. The IRBs that you work with have to agree that that's a non-significant risk device. If they don't, then it has to go to the FDA, so the FDA's provided a way to go to the FDA up front. So you get their opinion on whether the investigational device is significant or not significant in terms of its risk. Usual information, plus you send the protocol and the patient population. And then FDA gives you a written determination, yes, it is significant or it is not significant. There's really no meeting. But now you've got something you can take to the IRBs and say, look, FDA has decided this is not a significant risk device. And finally, submission issue meetings. These are after you've gotten a formal request for information, a deficiency letter in response to your formal submission. They're just looking to give you an opportunity to get clarification on the approach to responding to complex issues. They say it's not intended for pre-review of plan submissions. Same basic procedures, but you're going to actually have the meeting in 21 days. They do not want to try to stand in the way of what you're doing by saying you have to wait 90 days to get an answer from them. Well, that was a quick 10, 20-minute review of the guidance document, but let's go back through those slides and talk about some strategy and tactics. So what's a pre-sub? As I said, it's an excellent time to make a good first impression. Make sure you know your device, you know the literature. Make sure you're smarter than FDA. Read up on everything on FDA's website. And everybody in your organization should be on the same page. This is not a time to use the FDA to settle disagreements within your company. If you have disagreements, that's fine, but you need to agree on what you're going to say to the FDA and then how you're going to respond it. And certainly don't include anybody in the meeting who's going to ruin your meeting with a spurious comment or question. This has to be a very disciplined encounter. As much as you want to make it relaxed, it has to be disciplined as well. So send an email to the branch chief and try to meet them face-to-face at least the first time. Seeing people face-to-face gives you an opportunity to see the sort of emotional content of their question. You know, what's really driving them, who in the room really cares about the question, and just information flows faster when you're face-to-face. So if nothing else, try to meet with them face-to-face the first time. They get to know you, you get to know them. Now it's a whole lot easier if you're on the phone afterwards. So it's also an opportunity to sort out major issues in a non-adversarial manner. So again, I'd say focus on the patient, focus on the data, focus on risk mitigation. FDA doesn't like risk. If you say, this is new, this is great, this is innovative, the FDA is going to hear it's unknown, and unknown means there's risk. So there's a sense in which you don't want to get too excited about your device. Of course, you're passionate about it, but just lay out, here's the data, we're trying to help patients, here's how we mitigate risk. You don't have to win every single argument in a pre-sub. This is just the first of many meetings. What's really important is you develop trust. It's important that FDA believes what you're saying and understands why you're saying it. So use this as an opportunity to build trust, especially in the face of risk and newness. So it's also a time to educate FDA. We really find this is a major part of what you have to deal with. You have a tremendous knowledge about your device. FDA may have very little, and you've got to somehow get them educated and up to steam. There's a lot of stuff that FDA doesn't know. FDA is not a monolith of information. That's one of the problems about getting a deficiency letter. You don't get that sense of the variety of opinions. I've seen young reviewers versus experienced reviewers, and branch chiefs have different opinions. I've seen they don't really want to admit it, but you can sort of tell one branch is working against another. The Office of Device Evaluation may have one opinion, but they brought in somebody from the Science and Engineering Office. They have a different opinion. So the FDA is not a monolith of information, and if you can meet with FDA face-to-face, you begin to realize this. And another way, it's the best way to deal with a difficult situation is data. Sometimes people say you don't want to get FDA too upset, you don't want them to retaliate. I've not really had instances of retaliation as far as I know about it, but if it's complex, the best thing you can do is provide data. Get there face-to-face, get the attention of other people, and all of a sudden it's not one reviewer's opinion, it's really a scientific discussion. So under that factors to consider, again, this is to me sort of a basic decision tree. Either FDA has seen technology like yours or they haven't. If they've already seen technology like theirs, they've probably made up their mind on what they think is needed for testing, so it's good to know what's on their mind and possibly correct misunderstandings. It's too late when you've actually done the testing. If they haven't seen the technology before, well, then you need to educate them. Either way, I think there's to me at least, when something's new or controversial, there's a strong bias to say, let's go talk to them. Of course, the other thing is, where are you in the development cycle? How expensive is it to be wrong? So you've got patient risk, business risk, reputational risk. Those are the kinds of things people think about. There's probably not a great deal of patient risk involved because you're asking for advice. I suppose there could be some if you're not actually being straight up with FDA about what the product risks are, but I would never recommend that. You should always be just straight up on what the product's risks are. So the bigger question is whether it's worth the extra time to the development schedule versus the amount of, quite frankly, the money you're trying to save, the heartache you're trying to save. And that's a hard question to answer, but you have to sort of balance it against what I'll call reputational risk. You don't want to be coming to the FDA looking inexperienced or unknowledgeable about what their expectations are. You don't want to be coming with something that looks like you're just trying to cheat the system, so to speak. Maybe that's a little strong, I apologize, but you get the idea. You don't want to come off as somebody who's not trying to be straight with the FDA. So if you don't know the requirements, you need to ask, okay, but you need to get as informed as possible. If you're not sure of a course of action, asking for the easy path may not look the best. But if you think you've got a justifiable course of action, it may be worth asking for, even though it may face long odds. That's the other thing I've tried to tell people. Look, I'm looking at this thinking FDA is not going to accept this, but I understand you've got a scientific basis, so hey, let's give it a shot here. So as far as types of questions, a little more detail about kind of questions you want to ask. First of all, you should never go to the FDA with an empty basket. You should never say, what should I do? Make sure you have a well thought out plan, then ask the questions. So make sure you've got a case for what you're doing. Don't ask them, do I have to do this test? Say, look, we know there's a guidance out there that says we should do it, but we're deciding we don't need to do it, and here's why. If you've already done some tests, okay, do not include the results of those tests in the pre-IDE or the pre-sub. Their job is not to review your test data and say it's okay. They're not here to bless your results. They're actually going to wonder, well, why are you sending this if you've already done it? So what we've done many times when we're faced with other people having that situation is just say, look, tell them what the test is, but don't tell them about the results, because again, what you're trying to do is persuade FDA that this is the right testing to do. So, and again, just don't ask them vague questions like, what do I need to get approval? You really should have that figured out and then ask them to respond to your ideas. Here's our risk matrix. Do you agree with what we've captured everything? We found this to be a highly effective approach. We had one situation where it was the same device being used for a completely new application. We knew FDA was going to be skittish about it because of the application. And so what we did, we just laid it all out. Here are all the risks associated with the device, FDA. Here's how we plan on testing them. Did we miss any risk? And quite frankly, it just set the FDA at ease, because you're really putting everything out there and you're saying, hey, FDA, we're going to tell you everything we know about this device and how we're going to address it. And did we miss anything? And really they said, no, you didn't miss anything, and they proceeded to talk about the study that we were proposing. So do you agree with the proposed regulatory pathway? That's actually not a question you're allowed to ask in a pre-sub. That's really something for a 513G process, but sometimes you can just sort of do it in an unasking sort of way, leave the question unasked. So instead of saying, is it a 510K FDA, why don't you just start off by saying, here's our device, and we think it's a 510K device, and here's the predicate we're going to use. Because the fact is, they will comment. Every pre-sub we've done with the FDA. We ask them 3 or 4 questions. They give us the answers to 3 or 4 questions and proceed to tell us a lot of other things that we didn't ask for. So just sort of put it out there with some level of confidence. So, don't ask if you should do a clinical study. Say, here's all our bench testing and animal testing. Are we done, FDA? Don't ask if they agree with your clinical study design, if you're a little bit worried about what they might say about it. In one sense, just sort of lay it out there. Ask them something like the acceptance criteria, the sample size. If they think you need a 2-arm study versus a 1-arm study, they don't like your control arm, they'll tell you about it. So, types of more questions. Yeah, please review the animal testing protocol. Please review this clinical study outline. Don't send protocols for standard or well-accepted tests. If there's a standard out there, then don't send them the protocol. You're wasting their time. Do send them a comprehensive matrix of tests. Send them an outline or a draft for animal or clinical studies. You don't want to send them 100 pages of a clinical study and have them start picking on small points that aren't really relevant. If you're concerned about does this study comply with GLP or GCP, at that point I'd say, to be honest, hire a consultant. Don't let the pre-sub get into that level of detail. Let the pre-sub focus on science. Okay, so back to this, the contents of the pre-IDE. So for the device description, I call this the Goldilocks principle. You want to describe it not too much, but not too little. If you describe it too much, then you're stuck with this, oh, we changed it, and FDA is going to say, well, you changed it, so our advice doesn't apply anymore. You only need to tell them enough to make your case that this is what the testing is. And if you want to expose them to a little bit of your uncertainty, you might say, well, we're still debating whether it's going to be these 3 sizes or these 4 sizes, or we're still debating this. Fine, include that. But don't over-describe the device, because you don't want to get them lost in details that don't matter to your primary questions. But don't under-describe it, otherwise they can't actually answer the questions. So the previous discussions, yes, if you've had previous discussions, attach the key ones as attachments, maybe respond to some of their questions, but don't start off by saying, oh, by the way, I talked to you yesterday and let's discontinue the conversation. It's an informal submission, but it is in writing, so you need to develop it properly. They ask for development history. Just give them enough for a general sense. They really don't need a whole lot of detail to answer your questions. You just may want to tell them we've just started, or we hope to get into animal testing in a year or something like this, but not a whole lot of detail. Here's where, maybe I've said this before, here's where you really need to tell them the story. This is where you're going to spend most of your time. You need to give them the background information that they requested in the guidance document, but you also need to give them enough information to answer your questions. So they're not asking for everything that you know you need to provide them, and make sure that you spend a lot of time on that. Make sure you're also answering potential objections. You don't necessarily have to call them objections, but just say, here's some alternatives that we considered, and here's why it didn't work. And then, of course, meet face-to-face for first-time meetings or high-risk meetings. So let's talk about the time frames. So FDA schedules a meeting within 21 days. Please make FDA's life easy in this area. You're trying to have a scientific discussion, so if it's terribly inconvenient but they want to meet on a certain time, then that's what you try to do. Now, some thoughts on who should attend, right? So the question is, who will have the real input? I'm just going to say this. You really shouldn't have lawyers, and usually not any marketing people in the meeting. The FDA doesn't really care to hear from lawyers or marketing people when it's a science thing. The presence of a lawyer will actually put them on edge, makes them far less open. I have had one time where we had a marketing person attend the meeting because they were actually pretty close to a clinical expert in this area. They really had a great discussion. They were a great input. But unless they can really help elucidate some of the clinical areas or scientific areas, having a marketing person talking about marketing share or how awesome the device is isn't really going to be helpful. So know who's attending from FDA. You're supposed to ask for particular people to attend, but when you find out your attendance list from FDA, you may find out you're getting a whole lot more that you've asked for. So if they suddenly say we're bringing a statistician, then you better get your statistician. You thought that the questions on statistics weren't even worth asking, but now all of a sudden their statistician is showing up. That's a clue. And then control your consultants, especially physician and other experts and academicians. There's been plenty of a meeting that's gone off course when somebody decided to invite the world's leading expert on a topic, and then you find out, well, said expert doesn't really have much to lose as you do. They're their own person, and they've got their own opinions, and so they'll start rewriting your study on the fly to create a great research project for them, but the study won't actually answer the question, is the device safe and effective? So really control your consultants. This is where knowing who they are, making sure that they're unbiased in one sense, but also on your side in the sense of not going off half-cocked gets to be real important. And then it's nice perhaps to invite a few perhaps junior people for the sake of learning from the regulatory group. FDA is typically going to invite 2 or 3 other people who don't really have direct impact just to educate them. And so it's a good opportunity to educate those junior people on what these meetings look like. Back to that time frames. Hey, FDA says that they want the slides 2 days before the meeting. I would kindly advise ignoring this step. And here's why. Because 3 days before the meeting, you've gotten FDA's written comments, and they're usually extensive. And you're going to spend quite a bit of time reacting to those comments and discussing them internally and trying to figure out strategy and where did we go wrong or something like this. You're not really going to have time to suddenly finalize your slides. I hope you're working on the slides before that time, but trying to finalize your slides, not very helpful. And actually, the problem becomes then when you send in those slides, they read your slides ahead of time, and now you really not have a discussion. You're sort of locked in. The purpose of a meeting, whether it's over the phone or whether it's face-to-face, is to have a conversation. So we very often don't actually even give them the slides until after the meeting. We go through the slides, and then when we're all done, say, here they are. Because what you don't want to have happen is somebody take your slides during the meeting, start leafing through them, and missing what you're trying to say. So you don't want them prejudging your answers or failing to understand because they go to the end and sort of shut you down. So some thoughts on that slide preparation. So try to keep the formal presentation to 15 minutes. Review the device description, review the indication, review a few key points, and after 15 minutes say, here's our first question. Make sure you stick to the key messages. Skip any slides that talk about how awesome we are or how awesome the device is. Yeah, it's kind of nice to say, wow, we've been at this for 20 years or we've got the world's leading experts involved in this, but that's not what FDA is concerned about. You've got questions, they're going to try to give you answers. So ask the most important questions first. Now, they also say that you're not supposed to supply them new information. And I guess I have to agree with them. They've spent a lot of time looking over your information, coming to an opinion. If you come to the meeting with new information, you may get some kickback. And I'll be honest, I've seen this go a couple of different ways. I had one branch chief where that was just the end of it, and we really had to work around that. But most people are willing to tolerate a little bit of new information as long as it's not too much. If it's just a simple table or some discussion, really what you're trying to do is to just get involved in a discussion. So you're trying to say, hey, you came to this conclusion in your written comments. We don't understand this. Can we clarify this? So maybe that's what your slides do, is try to re-clarify that when we said this, this is what we meant, and let them react to that. So meeting, 75 to 90 days. Let's talk about the meeting itself. You will be amazed at how people get it when you talk to them face-to-face. You've got 6 people from the FDA in the room. You're going to find out who the drivers are. You're going to find out what drives them. When people are in the room, they pay attention to you, to be honest. You're on the phone with them. You kind of wonder who's paying attention. Senior management usually attends these face-to-face meetings. You'll get at least an assistant division director, maybe the division director itself, and they'll pay attention to you. The senior management may not have read the pre-sub. They may have only been marginally involved in writing the responses, but they're there and they'll listen to you. And just be honest, voices soften when people see you. Some people, including myself, you get on the phone and you want to yell louder for emphasis, but if you're face-to-face, it's just a lot more calmer, and people just interact with you in a very different way. So prepare and rehearse, prepare and rehearse. But I'd say, not too much, okay? You're trying to have a conversation, not a sales pitch, so you don't want to sound like you're trying to win them over, by the end of the day. Make sure you practice likely questions. Try to think up, okay, what would FDA ask about if we make that statement? And try to have somebody from the outside sort of play FDA, and it's kind of nice to have somebody who really doesn't know a whole about your project, so they can just sort of react to, I don't understand what you're saying, can you explain it better? Because quite frankly, there may be some key people at the FDA who don't understand it. Remember, it's about education. You know a lot, they only know a little. Know who's supposed to say what. Okay, don't have people answer questions outside their expertise. But you probably want to have one person as sort of the point person. All questions go to them, and they say, hey, I'll have Joe answer this, I'll have Joan answer this. Sometimes they may just be able to answer the questions quickly. That's hopefully why you have a senior regulatory person there. is to answer those questions easily without going into a whole lot of detail, because one of the things you learn as a regulatory person is say something and say no more, whereas people in other disciplines can have a tendency to want to get into the science mode of discussion. So prepare, rehearse, not too much. Be ready for chaos, to be honest. We've had situations where after we get to the second slide in device description, bam, FDA is saying, hold it, and all of a sudden your meeting, you felt like you've lost track of it. Sometimes after the first question, you find out that you're answering 7 of the questions and you don't have to answer any of the other questions. So you just sort of have to learn to roll with it. And just remember, you're trying to make a good first impression. You're trying to have a conversation. You may not win the argument right then and there, but you're collecting information and you're presenting information. So just take your time with it. So back to time frames again. So FDA, the sponsor is going to provide, we're supposed to provide draft minutes to FDA within 15 minutes. So when you're writing up these minutes, don't worry about this person said this person said this person said this. Just say FDA said. And don't worry about the 15 different opinions and the 3 different options that get voiced. Just settle on, the discussion was about this, FDA said this, the company agreed to this, and be done with it. And try to include some action items. Occasionally you might want to include a little bit more if you're trying to seed for future discussions. We said this, this, and this, so that as you're moving forward you can say, well, we did tell you that, and I'm sorry if we misunderstood that. So, but try to stick with actionable steps. And then don't ignore this step. I've had a few times where we said, here's the minutes, and we've tried to calibrate the minutes to make sure that if we thought we heard a couple of different FDA opinions, that we, in a sense, chose the one we thought they were coming out with. I'm not trying to say we're lying. We're just trying to say we heard a different thing. I think we mean this. And then FDA comes back and says, no, we meant this. Well, great. Now you got to say, are you sure you meant it? I thought you said this. Can we get some finalization on this? So this is really another opportunity to have another conversation with FDA about what do the meeting minutes say, what was actually agreed to, and what was the diversity of opinions. So feedback from the meeting, right? They have reasons they might change it, so you need to address this. So the key factors are time, clarity, and communication. So if you said you're going to get some tests done, get the test done. Don't meet so early in the process that all of a sudden too many things are changing, and it's been a year since you even had that meeting, and now you're doing the testing, and you hope it's still relevant. Remember the Goldilocks principle for device description, right? So if you tell them, well, we changed something, you can say, well, it was only a very small thing, and it doesn't really impact your previous decisions with FDA. But then again, if something has happened, then call them up, let them know that something's changed, and get their feedback on it, and get their agreement, hopefully, that, oh, yeah, all you have to do is to redo test 1, 2, and 4. You don't have to redo test 3. And then keep track of the science in your field. If FDA is going to come back and say, we learned something new, well, hopefully you know that, and when they tell you that, you can say, hey, I understand you may take it that way, but here's the way we understand it. And then there's this advice about clinical studies. We recommend that if more than 1 year has passed since our last feedback, you should contact the review branch. It's like, does a clinical study advice have an expiration date? That's, to me, that's sort of an odd piece of advice. But then again, a clinical study is something that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. And it just sort of behooves you that if you were getting their discussion and input into the clinical study design, and now as a year has passed and you've gotten all the bench testing done and all the bench testing is fine, you've done your animal test and everything is fine, now it's a year and a half because you had to redo something, but once you redid it in a modified design, something's fine. Before you launch into a clinical study, it probably is a smart thing to do to say, hey, we just want to make sure you're okay with that study design. Or maybe you'll end up saying, because of the device design, we need to resubmit. So I would take their advice. They call them after a year. Probably not for other types of tests, though. Here's an interesting thing. It's sort of buried in the notes, but the pre-IDE 510K PMA HDE bucket can also be for OUS or exempt studies, clinical studies. So these are studies that wouldn't show up in a formal submission for approval like an IDE, but they may be used to support your 510K or a portion of your PMA or HDE. So FDA has said, go ahead and use that same process to get feedback on an exempt or OUS clinical study. Same recommendations apply, and that is, don't give them the entire clinical study, just give them an outline. If you're already halfway through that study for some reason, then don't report partial results. Report this is the study. Are we headed in the right direction? Informational meetings. Hey, the FDA says you're supposed to share this information without expectation of feedback, but you will get feedback. You're going to learn about their knowledge base. They're going to make comments just because they're scientists or engineers. They're going to make suggestions probably about your device design. But you need to make sure you control the inner research scientist in you. You know, research scientists like to end papers with more research is needed. And so if you give something to FDA early in the process, they may start saying, oh, this is really cool. What about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And you sort of have to help them focus. Hey, we just want to make sure that, you know, thank you. That's a great idea. We'll think about it. But, you know, here's where we're headed in terms of our testing. And FDA officially says, well, we're not asking for that. But you should have some idea of what that is because they will start asking. And then study risk determination. So this is where you're trying to get FDA to agree that it's not a significant risk device. It's a little bit interesting because they tell you that they want the protocol and the patient population, but there's really additional information you need to give them. You should really perform a literature search that focuses on those risks. So when you're doing your PubMed or Medline search, you found all the literature, but don't dwell on every bit of piece of literature. Find the section where it says, well, this device had this adverse event, this device had this adverse event. Go look up in the MAUDE database, present your risk analysis that says, here, there's the only risk associated with it. And then, of course, use the FDA's guidance on significant or non-significant risk devices. That may help you understand that, well, it's not quite like this, but it's similar enough that we think it's not a significant risk device. Submission issue meetings. Right, so FDA says it's not intended to pre-review of planned responses. So, yeah, that's true, but what we've done a lot of times is said, okay, you've asked us 7 questions. Here's our planned responses, essentially our draft responses for all 7 questions. And the first question may be one where we simply say, yes, we will give you that information. Now, there may be more testing needs to be done, but we're just going to say, yes, we're going to give you the information, because now we're giving them a sense of, hey, you know, we're on the same page. We have some disagreements, but there are some things we agree with. So the second one, you may have already done the testing because the engineers just got right on it in the 21 days, but you're still going to say, hey, this is the type of testing we plan on doing. What do you think about that? So, and even if it's a simple thing, you can still go ahead and ask them. So a lot of that looks like a draft submission without the data. So that's sort of a tack that we've taken with submission issue meetings. It's worked very well. So then the other thing is just to stay focused on the science and the patient. You get this deficiency letter. It could be 3 pages long. It could be 10 pages long. Whatever it is, you're probably very frustrated at that point. And the key thing to do is to focus on the science and the patients. And here's sort of a provocative question. Does FDA like to argue? I had our senior official, a very well-respected senior official in our company bring this up, somebody well-respected with FDA, and they said, yeah, I think FDA does like to argue. Now, of course, we don't mean that we're supposed to be argumentative and FDA is supposed to be surly. That's not what we're talking about. But they do like to discuss public health issues. And if you can stay focused on the science and the patient and make your disagreements and your arguments in those terms, then you've got a winner. You know, to be honest, I think it's taken me about 20 years to sort of sort out this question of, you know, FDA saying something like, well, you just don't want to do the testing because it's costly. And really, that's not the attitude that you want to try to take. You really want to say, look, we just don't think this testing should be done because it doesn't make any sense from a public health standpoint. It doesn't actually answer the question you're trying to address. It's not the right method to do it. So it's not a matter of whether we want to do it or not. It's a matter of it shouldn't be done, whoever does it. And I think we just nailed our time pretty well. That was 45 minutes. And now we've got some time for case studies. I think before we proceed to the case studies, though, Joanne, if you're on the line, we'll try to answer some questions. Okay.
Sure, that would be fun.
Okay, so I've got 2 online questions, and I've been told maybe there's 3. The first one said, I didn't see a slide with a comprehensive matrix of testing. Okay, so I'm not sure what's meant there. I think
there was a slide earlier here. Let me pull it up.
Yeah, there should be a slide that says submit a comprehensive matrix of testing, but there wasn't a slide that says this is what it ought to look like.
Gotcha.
Okay. Yes. Oh, I see. When it says see previous slide, I meant the slide 2 back that says, or 3 back that says, do you agree with our test matrix? So I apologize for that. But if you're looking for an idea of what a test matrix would look like, let me sort of think out loud about this because I've done numerous of these but don't have it written down. So this may be a multi-page document, and your first table is going to be, your first column in your table is going to say something like either risk to be addressed or design input to be addressed. Then your second column will perhaps just give a simple title to the test, some characterization of it, like tensile test. Your third column might give a really very simple summary of the test, not even a paragraph, just a sentence or two to help them understand. So if it's a packaging test, you might say, we're going to do a bubble test, or a seal burst test, or both, or whatever that might be. And then the next line would be, the next column would be your acceptance criteria, where you say the test will be successful if whatever. And it may be that you have to then footnote 1 or 2 of those tests. Certainly if part of your test matrix is do an animal study, then you'll probably have a separate section saying here's our animal study protocol, or here's our summary of our animal study protocol. And so that'll be separate. So yeah, those are the basic columns in a test matrix. I hope that answers that question. Currently it has. Okay. Okay, next question. When can we expect FDA to provide the company with a list of their meeting attendees? Yes. They should have it well before. I'm trying to think. The main point is, of course, you want to get ready for who you're dealing with. And I'm just going to sort of pick a number. I would say that if they've committed to a meeting on date X, that if they haven't given you the meeting attendees, then 30 days before is a good time to bother them about it. Quite frankly, as I'm thinking about this, this is a sort of question that I don't ask until we've got the meeting figured out. But as soon as they got the meeting figured out, my email will say something like, hey, thanks, that's great. Do we know who's attending? And if they say no, then you'll say, well, I understand. At least a partial list would be great, that sort of thing. And then they'll say, well, it'll be me and my branch chief, et cetera. And then, okay, great. Hey, can you, let me know when it gets a little closer? And then you can come back 30 days before the meeting and say, hey, we'd like to know a little bit more, because obviously if you're going to bring a statistician or whatever, pick something, we need to make sure that our people are there as well. Please let us know. So as you can see, I've just added another 4 interactions in the process. And they're sort of administrative. They're not really technical, substantial, but you get an opportunity to tell the FDA and help manage the FDA in a way that hopefully is pleasant. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay. Another question. You said FDA provides no feedback after information meetings. What does the requester get out of this type of meeting? Well, it's sort of like show and tell. Hey, here it is. Do you understand it? More than anything. You're trying to get FDA to understand it. But as I said, they're real people. So if they don't understand it, hopefully they'll ask. And in the meantime, they'll say, oh, it uses that technology? Have you done this? Have you done this? So FDA doesn't always accept these sort of things. But that's, again, if it's really complex, it essentially gives you another opportunity to just talk about the device without actually talking about what the requirements are. So I hope that answers that question. Another question. For submission issue meetings, in a case where FDA has asked for more testing, how much data is needed to support our perspective that no additional testing is required? Okay. And I also have a comment about lost the audio on our end. So Joanne, I don't know if you can help with that. Joanne, are you there?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of responding to it right now.
Okay, somebody has it. That's good. Okay, so let me try to answer some questions. Okay, so submission issue meetings in a case where FDA has asked for more testing, how much data is needed to support our perspective that no additional testing is required? Well, that is very much an it depends question. Let me see if I can provide some general outline. Yeah, so if it's a matter of sample size, then that could be just a question of what level of risk is FDA willing to tolerate and try to change that into sample size. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. And it's a submission issue meeting. So FDA has asked for more testing. How much data is necessary to support our perspective that no additional testing is required? So, yeah, it may be that they simply misunderstand your device. So the data you're actually supplying them is more device description. It may be a risk management thing or a different perspective. It may be that you might try to find some clinical literature that might support this as a non-issue or review the MAUDE database. If the questioner wants to ask something a little more specific, we might have fun turning it into a case study, but I realize you might be sensitive to confidential things. Does the pre-sub apply to LTDs? And, I don't know. I suppose it does. LTD would be laboratory developed tests, right? To be honest, Med Institute is not a big specialist in IBDs, especially in that area. And that is such a hot button issue that I suspect that you default to the first question is, ask the FDA, can we meet for a pre-sub? Okay. Yes. Pre-submission, there's a comment. Pre-submission also opens the door for an interactive reaction with the reviewer. Yes. Yes, exactly right. Yeah, that's my point. You'll get at least 7 official interactions with FDA, but as soon as you start talking, it may come that they're supposed to give you feedback in 3 days, but that means they're going to meet 10 days before that. And don't be surprised if 9 days, it's a few days after that meeting, that they're going to come back and say, can you clarify this? Because if we could just straighten this out versus that out, we could give you a lot better written response. So yeah, good FDA reviewers use it as an opportunity to be interactive. Okay. Have you ever had a pre-de novo meeting? Can you describe your experience and what about it was most helpful? The short answer is no. The long answer is that we've been dealing with FDA on one product where we think it's de novo and they're not convinced, so it's been quite the ordeal. I can't really say much more than that. I have to imagine that it's much the same thing, but what you're going to focus on is what's sort of your preliminary draft of the eventual special control guidance that they're going to issue. Oops, sorry, lost a question. If it is completely new technology-based device, does FDA look for the safety profile in a pre-sub program? Well, the short answer is FDA only looks for the things that you ask them for. The longer answer is this is exactly what I was saying before. The best thing you can do is just lay all those risks out. The FDA, there's 2 parts to a device. There's the safe part and the effective part. You make an effectiveness claim, you make an safety claim. You're probably pretty confident about the effectiveness claim and how to test it, and that's usually just 1 or 2 tests. One of those might be a clinical study, but so be it. The safety part, though, there's lots of things that can cause problems. So if you put that risk matrix in front of them, now you're giving them a lot of comfort. And make them read it. If it's 20 pages, make them read it. When you give them a risk matrix, it'll have 5 or 6 columns in it. And somebody's going to read it, and you can maybe help them out by saying, hey, look, FDA, we've highlighted the ones that are the higher risk, and sort of let them deal with that way to make it a little bit easier on them. But you just really want to flesh out what their questions are. And if somebody doesn't read it, and then they say, well, what about this risk? You can probably tell them, look on page 6. We've addressed that risk. Okay. Another question. The guidance document states that you can request 3 meeting dates. Can you speak on the time frame to schedule those versus the 75 to 90-day meeting time frame? Well, yes. We generally have our time frames figured out. We generally clear our deck. So about the only thing that would say we can't meet on a certain date would be, I don't know. I think everybody I've dealt with at Cook has always said, I don't care who it is, even if I'm meeting with the president of the company, if FDA is only available on a certain date, that's when we're going to meet with FDA, because the president of the company says that's our policy. So you can try to ask for something faster. You can say, hey, we think this is really important. Can we meet in 60 days? But FDA is going to say 75. And when we talk about times, we just give them the whole day. We say we're able to meet on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday on this week, and make it earlier in the time frame and let FDA push it back. And try not to meet on Friday, because good luck getting out of Washington, D.C. on a Friday. Okay. I'm not sure I see any other questions coming through. I think if I understand this chat process, you're striking out any question that's been answered.
Yeah, if you want to keep the questions tab open, and it should be empty now since we've
I
answered
see.
all.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I'll try. I was in the chat tab. Thank you. Okay. So, okay. Michelle says that she's, repeating the question. Okay, so yeah, my apologies. And let's see if I give the same answer twice. Right. It really depends upon what testing they're asking for. But it may be that they've misunderstood the device, so you may need to re-describe it. It may just be a question of sample size, in which case you might have to negotiate. Yeah, that's kind of a hard question to ask. It's very, very individualistic. And I think what I said at the end is if you wanted to be allowed to go off mute and ask a scenario that's a little more specific, that'd be great. But we also have to be sensitive too. In fact, you have confidential information. Can we use the pre-sub to design the clinical study? I think the answer to that question is yes. If you have a big question, clinical studies are massive. An IDE is when you actually get the formal approval. But again, if it's complicated, you may want to use the pre-sub. Now the problem becomes the pre-sub has a feedback time frame of 75 to 90 days, and it's still informal. Whereas an IDE has 30 days, and now FDA's, whatever they say is potentially appealable. If they give you a disapproval letter, then you have a chance to appeal it, and you can kick into a submission issue process. But if the clinical study is a ways away and you know you're going to do something novel in terms of a clinical study, or you want to have an in-depth discussion about the acceptance criteria because there aren't anyone commonly available and so you're going to have to go back and forth with them, then the pre-sub may be a good place to do that. Okay. Next question. Would you please talk a little bit more about risk matrix development process? Well, I'll talk a little bit about it, but it's its own course. It's got its own, at least maybe a guidance document. Certainly, can't remember the name. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, and somebody's going to get upset with me that I got the wrong numbers. But ISO has a whole guidance on risk management, and included in that is developing a risk protocol. And that gives you a pretty good heads up on how you should develop a risk matrix. I'll tell you this, I'm a big fan of doing what's called a hazard analysis rather than FMEA. And FMEA starts with, here's a component, if it goes wrong, here's the different ways it can go wrong, here's the different things that can happen. Hazard analysis, is, at least as I've generally understood, it goes the other way around. Here's the device in its use. In step one, what are the things that might go wrong? How might they go wrong? Here's the components that make them wrong. And so you're starting from the larger to the smaller rather than the smaller to the larger. And I think it's a whole lot easier for FDA to conceptualize, and it results in generally a smaller table of risks. Okay. Here's a question. With only 2 weeks remaining on the FDA clock after 2 previous pre-subs, can we ask for a face-to-face Q-subs on their AI of clinical data? Looks like we're headed to NSE. Oh, okay, so let me think about that one. So there's been a 510K submitted because it says we're headed for NSE. You're on a 180-day clock. You've got 2 weeks remaining, and you've had 2 previous pre-subs. So I'm going to ask the person, are these submission issue meetings, as in they happened after you got the AI questions? Or are they otherwise. Yeah, and can we ask for a face-to-face Q-sub on their AI on clinical data? I guess there's no harm in asking. I'd love to hear a little bit more if you're willing to provide a little bit more. How many pre-subs can you do on a product? As many as you want. Sometimes at the end of the pre-sub, FDA is giving you advice, you don't like it. FDA will, you'll come back and say, this is what we think should be done, and FDA say, well, we have an area of disagreement. So there's another point on minutes. Minutes can certainly reflect we agree to disagree on this point, and sometimes we can agree to disagree on what was said in the meeting. And so at that point you say, can we keep this pre-sub open, and then you'll come back to it. At some point they will say, perhaps, we feel this pre-sub is closed. Practically speaking, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference except that you'll have to wait another 90 days. So there's more information about the questioner who's wanting to know, can we have a last-minute face-to-face meeting? I don't think they understand our data presentation and our double-counting data. Yeah, and here's the question again. Hey, I'd give it a shot. You have to ask kindly, and you have to realize you're asking for an exception. Hey, there's been once in a while, maybe I shouldn't say this in front of all these folks, but there's been once in a while where we've asked the FDA, can we have another couple of days, please, beyond that 180 days? And especially if you can gently get FDA to take some responsibility for the process taking so long, you might get a few extra days. I actually had that happen once, where I said, hey, FDA, we've not really had a very interactive review process. You've switched reviewers on us. You've gone back and forth on advice. Doesn't the folks deserve at least a little extra day, a little extra time? So you've got to be very careful about that, because you don't want to be antagonistic or give off the attitude that you're somehow special, but you can always ask. Okay. Let's take a break for a second. Let me go through these case studies. These are, to me, sort of more of interesting interactions we've had. So, a new surgical device. I'd tell you more, but it's not a cook device. But standard plastics and metals, about 20 parts, 3 major components. So you can see there's a little bit of assembly in here. It's not motorized. It's handheld. There's really no energy involved. But it's for new indication. There's nothing quite like it. So the question is, if I can get the slide to advance, where would you start with FDA on this? Now this one's a little bit unfair. You can sort of think about this for a second. But what we ended up doing was calling up the FDA, so actually sending them an email, getting their feedback on this. And then they said, look, we're not quite sure what this device is about either, so send in a 513G. 513G is named after a section, the 513G section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which says if you're uncertain about your classification of a device or whether it is a device, you can send us in some information and we'll give you an answer back in 60 days. You have to pay for it as well. So it's kind of like a pre-sub, but it's not really within the scope of this meeting. So we got that feedback from them. And then regardless of what that feedback is, we then submitted a pre-510K because we knew, based on the new indication, there'd be some novel ex vivo test methods. So, and once again, we had 3 or 4 questions. They answered the 3 or 4 questions and then gave us another dozen more, which we sincerely appreciated. Because after all, it's better to get it early in the process rather than when you sent in your 510K. Well, here's one. A non-vascular device, it's an implant, it's a 510K. There's several similar devices on the market. All of them are going to require clinical data. And we were considering using OES clinical sites exclusively. We had access to some data outside the U.S., and we wanted to know, is that going to be sufficient? So what did we do with that? What would be the next steps on that? Well, if we were hankering to get moving, we might just send it into a 510K, but we actually did have some time. So we scheduled a pre-IDE meeting, a pre-sub meeting, and based on what they said would be required of the data, remember we didn't actually give them the data, we gave them an outline of what kind of data they were going to be seeing in the submission. we came to the conclusion, well, for all that, we might as well just go ahead and have a U.S. study. So we sent them in an IDE, and we got a conditional approval. But then we looked at the conditional approval questions, and not only did we get some unreasonable requests to change, I think it was the follow-up intervals, but we also got some of those additional questions you now get with FDA where they say, well, we can approve your IDE study because of all the safety issues, but we're not convinced that it's going to be good enough to actually get you a 510K. And so we said, that sounds like a submission issue meeting. It's time to meet them face to face. And that was a very effective meeting because we really learned what mattered to the FDA. We found out that there was somebody from the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories that was driving some of these questions. And in fact, one of the senior persons, and not the senior person at FDA, basically looked at us and said, oh, if all you're trying to do is that's all you're trying to do, then just change your label and be fine with it. We'll be fine with it. So that was a great meeting because we really did get some questions answered. Here you go, a product variation of a PMA device, okay? We wanted to take a standard PMA device and change some of the components so it could be used with other manufacturers. It was marketed to be used with one specific manufacturer, but it was going to require an awful lot of changes. There was no one changing the indication of this, or the fundamental technology, but the client had a pretty good idea that it was going to require a clinical study. So we actually sent in a pre-IDE making at least a first attempt pass that it wouldn't require clinical studies, and FDA came back and said, no, it's going to require new clinical data. So we had we sent in an amendment to the pre-IDE. They said, ask us new questions. And we met with them. And it was a very effective meeting because we had a really great discussion about the regulatory pathway, whether this was going to be a new PMA or whether it's going to be a panel track or a 180-day supplement. There were some questions about device compatibility, so we figured out how to deal with those. We were able to clarify the regulatory pathway and the clinical study design. So that was just an excellent time to have a meeting because we captured it soon enough. And then this is the fourth case study. We had an HDE device already approved for one indication, no changes in designs, minimal changes to the IFU. We had our humanitarian use device in place, and we were considering a literature-only approach to clinical data, which was going to be unique. If you look at most HDEs, there's usually some controlled clinical study, but Cook did the first HDE. It's for a fetal bladder stent, and we basically collected information from a physician who was doing it. So it wasn't a prospective study. It was just a collection of information, and FDA accepted that. And we were trying to give that same approach. And so I called up the branch chief, and the branch chief said, whatever you do, please let's have a pre-HDE meeting, because FDA doesn't really like a 75-day time frame for an HDE. I mean, they get 90 days for a 510K, and presumably HDE is sort of like a PMA, but not having to prove safety. But there's a lot of questions that they're going to ask, and 75 days isn't time to ask them, so they almost always want a pre-HDE meeting. So there's just a little tidbit of information. Okay. So we've got 3 more questions, and I think we have time to answer them. Is the 90 days a hard 90 days? I'm not quite sure of the answer to that question, but I'm sure the answer is no. You're going to press them to get done in 90 days, but don't be surprised if you're trying to negotiate time frames that they might say we'll meet on day 91. And to be honest, you have to ask yourself the question, what's more important, getting it done in 90 versus 95 days, for instance, or getting the right people in the room? That I've had too many times where, memo to file, folks, try not to send in answers to questions on December 15th, because if the branch chief's on vacation, you may get a different answer that you want. So it's much more important to get the right people in the room, even if you have to wait for them. Will you have the same reviewer each time? You hope so. You request so. Can't guarantee so. People change their duty stations, so to speak, so you can't really control that. But there's a high predisposition on both sides to have the same person. You might consider, if you know that person's moved on, to ask them to nevertheless attend the meeting to help provide some perspective, even though somebody else is a lead reviewer. So you might be able to borrow them for a couple hours. so to speak. You can try. Can you discuss the importance of the proposed indications for use for a first-of-kind product and first pre-sub, i.e. the company is not fully clear on what the indications for use for, as it may be a de novo or a PMA product? That is a great question. I think that may in fact be your first question in your pre-sub. You may say, we want to go for this indication. If we do, here's the kind of testing we think is necessary. If we're also considering this indication, do we think this testing is necessary? And that might generate enough of a meeting to be done with it. And again, as far as de novo or PMA product, I might suggest that if you're firmly convinced it's not a 510K, then you might just say in your introductory cover letter, hey, here's our product, we're submitting it via de novo, but in the meantime we have some questions. But if you think it's a de novo, they'll probably want to have a de novo meeting to discuss it. So that would be one of your first questions. I hope I answered that question well enough. There seems like there might be more there. Hey, the company is not fully clear. Feel free to ask a follow-up question. What is the difference between a pre-IDE and a pre-sub? My apologies if I wasn't clear on that. A pre-IDE is technically part of a kind of pre-sub. So that would be the main distinction, because a pre-HD, pre-PMA, and pre-510K can all be pre-subs. And the confusion is because the pre-subs are part of the pre-sub guidance document, but so are other meetings that aren't pre-subs, such as informational and submission issue meetings. Okay, so I got a follow-up comment from the person talking about IFU. The IFU tips everything one way or another. I would strongly advise you folks to come in with a strong sense of this is what we want to do, and a strong support on why that's okay. Because I'm afraid, as I think about this some more, if you give them two different indications for use, you're sort of letting them drive the process. And you don't really want to have that happen. You want to figure out what you want and go for it. And then let FDA say, no, you can't do that. And now you've got a conversation. Well, if we have this as our indication, does that eliminate that as a testing requirement? Yeah, I would try to go for, I'd go for what you really, really want, and try to make the argument about why it's not a PMA, I guess, in this case. So, more thoughts. Any other questions? I've got none posted for me to look at.
No, Dan, it looks like actually there is a follow-up question, and you should see it now.
Okay, excellent. Follow-up question regarding the amount of testing data needed in a submission meeting. How to determine what is appropriate? Okay, so FDA has said that they're not pre-reviewing your responses. So in that sense, they don't want to see the data. They want to see how you're going to address it. So you might say, again, you sort of don't want to give them a test that you're not certain of the results of. But they also don't want to see the results of the test. So I'm going to try to make up an example. FDA wants you to test 5 extra tensile joints. Okay, that's probably a pretty trivial test. And so you probably just do it and say, sure, we'll do that. But I'm just going to use that as an example. Before you say to the FDA, yes, we're going to test them and here's our method, because maybe it's something novel about the method, do the test. Make sure you can pass it. And then come back to them and say, hey, FDA, our response is we're going to do this test. But don't tell them the results. Just say we're going to do this test. Is this test what you're looking for? Hopefully that gets it. Let me know, the questioner, if that was okay.
Okay.
I guess the other way that the person might also be asking this question, if I've got 10 pages worth of questions from the FDA, how many of them could be a topic of a submission issue meeting? Well, okay, if you've got 10 pages of questions, then yes, don't give them preliminary responses to things where you're going to say, I agree with that. Find the 2 or 3 that are really making a difference and focus on them. And then maybe throw in the other ones. But a lot of times, if you get 10 pages of questions, you may just have some fundamental misunderstandings. And that may be the first thing you need to clear up based on having discussions with the reviewer outside of a formal submission issues. Okay, so here's the follow-up question. But what if we disagree about the testing requested? So at some point, FDA is going to get tired of having a submission issue meeting and is going to tell you just submit it. And that's where you got to deal with it. You may be facing that they're not paying attention. And as a company, you're going to have to make up your mind. Do we fight this fight and go on record that we think this is good enough, or do we concede the point? And you get involved in the same sort of difficult discussions of, what's the cost of doing it over again? What's the cost of waiting 90 days to get the answer, et cetera. This much is clear. It's sort of a basic negotiating technique. Maybe this is worth talking about. When you're talking with FDA, you got to make it clear, hey, we both have the same goal. We want to help patients. And we sort of understand where your question is coming from, but we think there's a different tack to take. And you've got to be able to supply them with some new piece of information in order for them to change their mind. It may be a trivial piece of information, and in fact, what you're really trying to do is persuade them of the information you already gave them. But if FDA's made a decision based on a certain amount of information you gave them, simply giving them the same information is not going to make them change their mind necessarily, unless they can honestly say, oh, we misunderstood. Because the fact is, you may think they misunderstood, but they didn't misunderstand. It's you who are misunderstanding, sorry. But that's kind of what you'll have. So it's always good to say, okay, you want us to do these 3 tests. Well, we can do this one test and maybe this other test that will address what you're really asking for. Okay. The pre-sub reviewers always, sometimes, rarely the actual submission reviewers. Depends on how fast you can get back to them. Plain and simple. If your pre-sub is a year out, they try to stick with the same person. It just makes sense for them. And you should ask for that person. You should say, hey, FDA, we had a pre-sub, the lead reviewer was such and so, we'd like to have that same person. And it doesn't hurt to ask. Okay. Here's a question. We have the same device with 2 different indications and the result 2 510Ks at different divisions. Oh, I remember those days. They weren't to the same division, the different division, they were the same divisions, but I remember having to submit 2 510Ks on the same day, and they were both large. Both AIs arrive on the same time with the same biocompatibility questions. Can I request a joint Q-sub submission? Yes, you should request a joint Q-sub submission issue meetings. If you're submitting the same device and you're getting almost the same, perhaps exactly the same, what's likely happening is that those biocompatibility questions are being deferred to a specific biocompatibility expert, and they're the ones you really need to get the attention of. So now you've got the question. You hope that they're, different divisions. You have my sympathies already because different divisions have different priorities. You will want to make sure that you have both division directors in that meeting. In fact, I would recommend that you don't proceed unless you have either a division director or an associate division director, somebody who's there to speak for the division. And in fact, we had a situation, it wasn't 2 510Ks, but it was a device where it was falling under the purview of 2 different divisions, and we could just tell that there was strong disagreement going on between the 2 different divisions. And that was one of the reasons why we were getting bad feedback from the FDA. So if you've got 2 different divisions involved, get them on the same page and explain to them why you want them on the same page. Okay, hopefully that answered it. Next question. Anything else?
Questions that were submitted. So let's see. We have about 10 minutes remaining. I'm going to go ahead and end the webcast a little early. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to email them to me and I will get them to Dan. So right now I wanted to conclude today's webcast, and I'd like to thank Dan Dillon for taking his time. Yeah?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, my contact information is on the last slide, which I should probably put in front of people again. And I thank you very much for your questions, to be honest. It's nice to hear some of the issues that people are struggling with. And I appreciate that, having this time to give you some feedback. And hope this has been helpful in setting up a good attitude for having these kind of interactions with the FDA.
Thank you, Dan. I hope this was very valuable, as apparent by all the Q&A that were going on. So thank you so much, Dan. Please remember to go back to the RAPS Learning Portal and complete the webcast evaluation for this webcast. Once you complete that, you'll be able to print your documentation of attendance, which is your RAC credit. Your feedback is important for us to keep improving our programs. The recording of today's webcast will also be made available in the RAPS Learning Portal within 24 to 48 hours. Thank you so much for participating in today's webcast, and I hope everyone enjoys your day. Thank you.
Thank you.